4 weeks. 4 weeks in a row where the most confident picks all come through. What more do you want from me, man? I'm feeding off free money. Past 4 weeks have been flawless in the most confident picks. This week we had Narulo, Ian Gary, Abdul, and Arman. They all came through. I was thinking of making Asu a confident pick as well, and that fight kind of played out close, but he even got a 6 submission win. That Tagir pick, that didn't age nicely. He got absolutely dominated. Credit to Hiroguchi. He looked like an absolute monster in there. And that guy's going to be a problem in the UFC. But yeah, confident picks, they all come through. They've been feeding me. Hope y'all been eating from them too. Because I've been swimming in cash this past month. And the fun duo parlay, that was actually a fun one too. Orbai came through with a monstrous knockout and Topuria with a dominant performance. Honestly, all week I was telling myself, like, why were these odds so close? Topuria was going to be a confident pick of mine, but people were acting like Bekzat, his opponent, is the next big thing. So, I don't know. I couldn't understand why. Topuria had the size and power over him. I knew it wouldn't even be close, like, as the fight played on, but that was a fun one for sure, because in the beginning, it did look close. Bekzat was landing a few shots. But I kept telling myself, it's only a matter of time until that Topuria style just takes over. And especially having the wrestling advantage as well, those striking openings were bound to be opened up, right? And both underdog picks, they got absolutely slimed out. It's kind of funny. The two underdogs I had faith in, and they got sent into the shadow realm. But honestly, great week. Once again, 4 for 4, 4 out of 4 confident picks come out on top for the 4th week in a row. Just absolutely legendary stuff right now. I'm on a generational run. These past 4 weeks have made me a decent amount of cash, decent amount of pocket change, and I'm giving this stuff out for free. I'm gonna have to start charging for these picks, man. Nah, I'm just playing. But I hope y'all enjoyed the fights, man. Let's continue on with these picks. Hope y'all doing well, man. Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC 323 Merab versus Yan Part 2, where I'll be breaking down, predicting, and discussing every fight on the card. Let's dive into the first fight of the night, where we got Iwo Baraniewski versus Ibo Aslan. So my pick for this fight is going to be Iwo Baraniewski. I'm going to pick Iwo Baraniewski to win this fight. When Aslan first entered the UFC, I thought he was going to be a serious contender. And he looked good, winning his first 2 fights by TKO. Although those guys weren't the best contenders. Then Aslan goes on to win or to lose his next 2 fights, getting submitted by Iwon Cutelaba, and then having a weird staring contest with Billy Elikana in this most recent fight. It's starting to be clear he isn't really a high-level fighter, and now to think he is about to be on a 3-fight losing streak here, it's kind of mind-boggling, but I'm going to say it happens, which is unfortunate, because Aslan seems like a pretty cool guy, but he's fighting someone that looks really promising. Iwo Baraniewski, he's coming off of a sick knockout victory as a plus 250 underdog on the Contender Series, where he knocked out his opponent in 20 seconds. And his opponent was supposedly the next big thing, and Baraniewski shut all his hype down. And it was a clean slip right hand that got the job done. He hunted him down for as long as the fight lasted, and as soon as the opponent threw a punch, he instantly slipped, countered, and finished the job. And that hunter-like fighting style while staying composed is what you like to see in a fighter. Both him and Aslan have 100% finishing rate in their wins, but Aslan only has knockouts, and Baraniewski, he has 2 submission wins on his record, and Baraniewski comes from a grappling background. So he's the more well-rounded fighter here, in my opinion, whereas Aslan is more aggressive, come forward, a finisher, just looking to knock your head off, right? Lots of pressure, looking to overwhelm you, but I doubt Aslan is going to get a quick finish like how he usually does when he wins. And even if Aslan tries to pressure him with the strikes, Baraniewski's composure, it seems legit. I think he can weather an early storm, land some nice counters, employ some grappling, and just wear down on Aslan's gas tank, and could even find a submission victory here. Because Baraniewski's composure, it's high level from what I've seen from just the eye test, right? He hunts you down. He's got sharp counters. Plus, just looks so impressive in that Dana White Contender Series fight where he just got the 20-second knockout. Along with having a grappling base, he just seems like a well-rounded fighter. Whereas Aslan, he's more an aggressive brawler. Heavy pressure. The durability and his ceiling, it's questionable. 2 straight losses. I'm gonna pick Iwo Baraniewski to win. I think he has the better composure, the cleaner counters, and a deeper skill set. I think he's gonna survive the early heat and just outclass Aslan as the fight goes on. Moving on to our next fight, we got Muhammadjan Naimov versus Marion Santos. This was a tough fight to pick, but I'm gonna lean Naimov to get this win. Naimov, he's such a tough fighter. 31 years old right now, in his prime years. He's pushing a great pace in his fights, walks you down with his striking, has heavy leg kicks. He's susceptible to be taken down, but Marion is going to want to strike with him here. And Marion is still a decent striker. He looked good in his last fight. He's got nice speed and power. Also likes to push the pace and move forward. In his last fight, Santos, he looked good in his last fight versus Sadiq Yusuf. But beating Sadiq Yusuf, it isn't the most impressive victory. And before that, in his fight with Francis Marshall, Santos himself said he was lucky to get the nod from the judges there. It was a controversial split decision that could have easily went the other way, and he got dropped in that fight. Coming up against Muhammadjan Naimov, I think he might just get outdogged here. When the striking gets competitive, I see Naimov shooting for takedowns and just doing more to win here. I like his takedowns, and I like his control time. I don't see Santos finishing Naimov early, meaning this fight is probably going to go 3 rounds. So that just means Santos has to maintain that striking distance for all 3 rounds and defend takedowns. But I see Naimov throwing hard leg kicks, closing the distance, working in the clinch, wearing down Santos and getting this fight to the ground. Because Naimov himself, he pushes a high pace, and he's got great leg kicks, and he's durable. And I like how he mixes in his takedowns along with his striking. He's got that pushy, that gritty pressure fighting style. Whereas Santos, he does have the nice fast hands with decent power. But I wasn't really too impressed with that split decision win over Francis Marshall, and I'm just not sure how consistent he's going to be as a fighter in the UFC. So I'm just going to lean with Naimov here. I think he's going to push a good pace, mix levels, and wear Santos down over 3 rounds. Moving on to our next fight. Mansur Abdul-Malik versus Antonio Trocoli. There was no odds for this fight at the time of making this recording, so I just put the odds based off of what I think they will be. I'm going to lean Mansur Abdul-Malik here. I'm a Mansur Abdul-Malik A1D rider. I believe in his hype, and I think he's the truth. His last fight with Cody Brundage, it did get overturned to a draw because of the head clash, but he was going to win that fight. Every fight with Brundage always has some weird thing going on. Mansur was going to win. He finished every fight before that, and the guy truly is a monster. Explosive finishing ability, serious power in his hands, has a wrestling base, dangerous ground and pound, and dangerous on the feet as well. Coming up against Trocoli, this should be an easy win for Mansur. Trocoli, he's 0-2 in the UFC, getting TKO'd by Shower Bullet, which is forgivable, but then getting submitted by Tresean Gore. Like, come on. Even when he wins, it's nothing special. He doesn't look dominant at all, and he's getting finished in his losses pretty often. I see Mansur being better literally everywhere the fight goes. He'll be the better wrestler, the better striker. Trocoli has some pretty bad striking defense, and I can see Mansur landing a clean shot on the feet. Mansur is much more explosive and can definitely land whenever he wants. Trocoli might need to lock in a quick submission somehow if Mansur makes a mistake during the grappling exchange, try to use his length and size, but I seriously doubt he'll have any success doing that. Mansur is just too good for any of that. And on top of that, Trocoli's striking defense is really poor. This should be Mansur all day long. Because Mansur's explosiveness, it's real. He's got big power, strong wrestling, relentless finishing instincts. While Trocoli, he's big, but he's hittable. Poor striking defense, getting finished often, and low UFC success. He's got a low UFC success rate. So the pick obviously has to be Mansur for me. He's the superior athlete. He's better everywhere. I think he's going to find a knockout or just ground and pound finish him. Ground and pound finish him. Yeah, that sounds about right. Moving on to Chris Duncan versus Terrance McKinney. The pick is Chris Duncan. Chris Duncan was a massive underdog versus Jordan Vucenic, a big underdog versus Mateusz Rebecki, and I picked him to win both times. This guy is really good. When will you guys realize that this guy, Chris Duncan, is really good? I was hoping he wasn't the underdog in this matchup, because that would be him being an underdog for the 3rd time in a row, but that would have been insane. I don't think he should be an underdog here or any time in the future. I see him winning this fight versus Terrance McKinney, who's on a nice 2-fight finishing streak, but to some mediocre level fighters, I don't see him beating Chris Duncan. Duncan is just too skilled, too much of a dog. And when McKinney loses, he's getting finished. Like his durability, it's not great at all. Literally, all his losses have come by finish. 7 losses, 5 by knockout, 2 by submission. This guy has never lost a decision. He never even won a decision. Meaning, if he isn't finishing you, he's getting finished. Meaning, I don't see him finishing Chris Duncan, so I see Chris Duncan finishing him. Look, I couldn't believe Chris Duncan was an underdog versus Rebecki, even versus Vucenic. I thought the odds were way off, and they obviously were. And Duncan showed how good he is in both fights. Submitted Vucenic, beat the actual piss out of Rebecki, and I see him putting a beating on McKinney here as well. One of the reasons why I'm such a believer in Duncan is because of his fight in the Contender Series versus Charlie Campbell. Literally, probably one of my favorite knockouts of all time. It probably is my favorite knockouts of all time. Duncan was getting clipped over and over again, getting backed up. But he stayed composed, He found the perfect opening and times a beautiful shot, flatlines Campbell, and just walks off like he's taking a stroll in the park. He's never out of a fight. He never quits on himself. And that's why I'm such a big believer in him. Currently on a 3-fight win streak, showing he's a clean striker. He's got heavy hands, super durable and gritty, and can find submissions. He's aggressive, he's relentless. And coming up against Terrance McKinney, McKinney's going to be a fast starter. He tries to get you out of there as soon as possible, but if he isn't successful, the fight never goes his way. Duncan can definitely weather that storm and just outdog McKinney through the fight and find a submission win. I doubt McKinney finds an early finish on Duncan. Duncan's going to stay composed, can even mix in his wrestling if he wants. And if it turns into a brawl or a dog fight, I have no doubt that Duncan has more dog in him, because on top of being such a dog, a durable dog, he's got clean power. He's composed under the fire. 3-fight win streak right now. He's been looking good, and he thrives in chaos. While McKinney, he is pretty deadly early. He's dangerous, but he'll collapse if the fight doesn't go his way early on, if he doesn't get the finish. And all his losses have come by finish. So I'm gonna say that Duncan survives the first round. Then he just starts drowning McKinney and finishes him late with a submission. Moving on to our next fight, we got Jalin Turner versus Edson Barboza. I'm gonna pick Jalin Turner, and I'm happy to say that. I'm happy for Jalin Turner. He comes back after retiring from his last fight. He found his drive again. He just needed a break from the sport, and I'm really glad they gave him a winnable fight here. Even though Jalin has lost 4 out of his last 5 fights, 2 of those losses were split decisions to some pretty good fighters in Mateus Gamera and Dan Hooker. But here, this is definitely a winnable fight for him here. Facing someone 39 years old, 4 inches shorter than him, a past his prime, Edson Barboza. I haven't really been impressed with Barboza lately. I even picked Barboza to lose his last fight versus Jakar Close. I knew Close would be good enough on the feet to pressure him in the clinch against the cage and work some clinch strikes. Close was even landing nice shots in the striking exchanges. Like Barboza, he's not the same fighter anymore. He's not the same fighter he used to be. His physique looks sick. And he's had some pretty he has some pretty powerful strikes, still, especially with his leg kicks, but he's nothing like what he once was, especially at 39 years old. Nothing has been standing out too much in his game lately. He definitely he's got some powerful calf kicks, but that's really about it. Turner, he's going to be aware of that. He'll be longer in height and reach, and he's got power in his shots himself. He could have knocked out Renato Moicano if he didn't attempt a walk-off knockout. Like his losses, really, they're not that bad. Split decision losses to decent fighters. He could have beaten Moicano if he wasn't basically an idiot. And losing to Ignacio Bahamondes is an actual killer. So I think he has what it takes to beat an aging Barboza. Using his long reach, he can snipe Barboza on the outside, and even on the ground. Turner has some slick submission skills that even that's even a possibility for him here. The thing about Turner is that he has 100% finishing rate in his career. He's never won a decision. He comes to fight, and I think he'll maintain composure until he hurts Barboza and then go in for the finish and be much more aggressive in getting that finish rather than attempting a walk-off knockout. Yeah, and I like the fact that he took a break from the sport. He wouldn't be so burnt out here. He's fresh, and I think he'll be okay in this matchup. Barboza's game, using those heavy leg kicks, it should be too predictable for Turner. Even if Barboza keeps striking range, I still see him eating shots from the outside, and especially when it gets into the clinch, Barboza, he's a veteran, But I don't think he can. I don't think he can survive the storm from Turner. Because Turner's long. He's sharp. He's got good power. So slick submissions. Plus he's refreshed coming off of this break, right? I think, and he's a great finisher as well. Barboza at 39 years old, still dangerous kicks, but he's slowing and he's struggling versus like fighters who can bring on that pressure. So I'm gonna say that Jalin Turner uses his range, his speed, and his power to overwhelm an aging Edson Barboza. Moving on to our next fight. Marvin Vettori versus Bruno Ferreira. I'm going to say that Bruno Ferreira wins this fight. Bruno should be the better fighter. He's dangerous on the feet with serious power in his hands. He's got slick submission skills, comes forward with heavy pressure. He looked good in his last fight. Took his opponent down, submitted him really quickly. Exactly what he needed to do when facing a rookie like Jackson McVeigh, And it seems like Bruno, he's always facing guys who are much taller than him. He's short for this middleweight division, but he finds a way. He also took down Armin Petrosian. He ground and pounded him, and then found a submission in his fight before McVeigh, right? So he's on a nice little 2-fight win streak. He even has a knockout win over Gregory Rodriguez, which is really impressive. Now he's facing Marvin Vettori. I don't think Marvin is dangerous enough on the feet to threaten Bruno Ferreira. Marvin doesn't have a single knockout win in his UFC career. He puts up some good pressure and volume, but I don't see him being enough to deal with someone as dangerous as Bruno. Plus Marvin is known for his granite chin. He's never been knocked out or submitted, but that's not something you want to be known for. You don't want to be known as the guy who can take a beating and keep fighting. I see Bruno landing some seriously damaging shots here. I wouldn't even be surprised if he finds a finish here. Considering Marvin has never been finished. Marvin's been through some wars. It's only a matter of time until his chin cracks, and Bruno has the power to sit him down, especially with how hittable Marvin is. Marvin is just decent everywhere, but he mostly just comes forward with no real intent to hurt guys. He can be outclassed and outstruck by well-rounded guys. I definitely see Bruno having success in the striking, even in the grappling. Bruno's going to put up a storm in the first round. I think in that first round, he'll do enough damage on Vettori to the point where he's compromised for the rest of the fight, even if Bruno doesn't get him out of there. Marvin's going to have to get this fight in the clinch, and make it boring to try to neutralize Bruno's dangerous power. But I think throughout the fight, the bigger moments should go to Bruno. The guy's a dog, and he just keeps looking for big shots and submissions everywhere the fight goes. Even if Marvin uses his footwork and tries to avoid the power, Bruno should land the better shots and win at least the first 2 rounds, right? Third round might be close because Marvin will still keep fighting if he isn't finished, but Bruno will have the better moments overall. Because Marvin, yeah, he's durable. He puts a high pace, but there's no real dangerous threat in his hands. It's volume without real danger. Whereas Bruno, he's got the explosive power. He's got deadly submissions. He puts up an aggressive early storm. So I think Bruno's gonna land the bigger shots. He's gonna hurt Marvin and win the bigger moments of this fight. Moving on to our next fight, Nazim Sadykhov versus Fares Ziam. This was a really tough pick. Tough fight for me to predict. Both guys are super dangerous. Neither have been knocked out, but I'm leaning Fares Ziam because he'll be taller. He'll fight the more safer fight. He doesn't put himself in dangerous situations, whereas with Nazim, he takes more risks. He puts himself out there to be countered more often. Excuse me. And there was a moment in his last fight with Nicolas Moura where Moura was teeing off on him. There was a chance that Moura could have knocked him out. And then Nazim, yeah, he weathered the storm and eventually broke him down. But even in his fight before that with Ismail Bonfim was finding success in the striking exchanges until he landed a kick that caused a doctor stoppage, until Nazim landed a kick that caused a doctor stoppage. So, I see Fares Ziam being much more measured in his approach. Obviously Nazim, he has great striking, decent grappling, very durable and aggressive. But for us, Ziam is on a 5-fight win streak right now, looking so good, dangerous technical striking with power behind his shots, well-rounded as well, really long and tall compared to the rest of the division. And, we've only seen him be vulnerable to submissions, and Nazim is more of a striker than a grappler. I think it's really impressive for us to be coming off of a win over Mike Davis. Davis is an absolute beast, and to outpoint him for 3 rounds shows the level that Fares is at. And before that fight, getting absolutely a brutal knockout victory over Matt Favola. Faris Ziam, he's definitely a problem in this division. You know, Nazim Sadykhov, he's going to be aggressive and try to overwhelm Faras, try to land damaging shots on him, but I don't see him consistently landing those damaging shots. You know, he might land a few, but not enough to put Faras Ziam out, you know, and if that's the case, I can see Faras being measured, fighting safely at range, outpointing him, you know, using his reach and his length, you know, fighting the smarter fight, landing more kicks from the outside, and he can counter the aggressive shots from Nazim as well. You know, as long as Faras doesn't get taken down and submitted, I can see him outpointing Nazim and being the smarter, more safer fighter. You know, Faras has been looking so good, especially coming off of a really good win over Mike Davis, right? But you know, it's a close fight because Nazim, he's aggressive, he's powerful, he's willing to take risks, but I think he's hittable. Whereas Ziam, he's more the tall, technical, disciplined counter striker, safer style, 5-fight win streak. So I'm gonna lean with Ziam here. I think he's gonna use his range management really well. He's gonna have some clean counters, and he's gonna avoid the dangerous shots, and just outpoint Nazim for as long as the fight lasts. Moving on to our next fight, Grant Dawson versus Manuel Torres. I'm gonna pick Grant Dawson. You know, I think Grant Dawson is a great fighter. He has his eyes on the title. He wants to become a champion. He's talking about becoming a champion. He's got a bigger vision, you know. And I mean, he has 11 wins in the UFC, only one loss. And if it wasn't for that one weird loss to Bobby Green, this guy probably would have had a title shot by now, or at least a number one contender fight. He's an elite level fighter, and people love to call him just a grappler, but in his last fight, his striking, it looked legit. You know, he looked like O'Malley out there throwing spinning wheel kicks and managing distance really nicely, then eventually getting the fight to the ground and doing what he does best, you know, smothering opponents on the ground and wearing them down. And I'm not sure what the stat is, but I think he has like the most top control time out of any fighter. It's something like that. Like he would just lay on you and just wear you down where when he has you on the ground. So he's just a dominant grappler. He has like that Khabib like style. But does the Bobby Green loss worry me in this matchup? 100% it does. You know, Bobby Green landed a single jab and knocked out Dawson in one of the weirdest knockouts I've ever seen. You know, it looked like there was barely any power behind that shot, and it just folded Dawson. You know, coming up against a crazy, hectic power puncher like Torres, that scares me. You know, Torres hits like an absolute truck. You know, his knockout over Nicolas Mora was vicious, even in his last fight. Brutal knockout win over Drew Dober. You know, if this guy touches you, you're going to sleep. Torres, his only UFC loss was to Ignacio Bahamondes, and Bahamondes is an absolute killer. So I'm just saying, if Torres lands anything significant, Dawson's chinny durability won't help him out. Won't help him out at all here, you know. But I think the safer pick is Dawson. You know, he has been managing distance really nicely. You know, not letting his opponents get close recently, not getting hit often, fighting safely, and getting the fight to the ground and dominating in that way. You know, Torres is gonna need to land a big shot early on in the first round to have a chance of winning this fight. But if he doesn't land that shot, I see Dawson being safe in the striking, managing distance, then securing the takedowns. You know, he'll be happily doing that. He'll be willing to do that for all 3 rounds. You know, he doesn't put himself in dangerous situations striking for long periods of time. So the safer pick is Grant Dawson. You know, Torres, he's gonna need a home run knockout shot, whereas Dawson, he's just looking to grind on him and dominate all 3 rounds. And I don't know, Dawson gives me future title challenger vibes, while Torres gives me hood street fighter gangster vibes, you know, because I think they just have like different visions. Dawson, he gives off like more of an elite caliber fighter. He's got his eyes on the title. He's got elite top control and improving striking. Puts up a great pace, but his chin is questionable. And he's facing Torres, who has nuclear power, and he'll kill Dawson if he touches him clean on the feet. You know, he's a first round menace. But I'm gonna say that Dawson stays safe. He manages his distance, and he just wrestles for 3 rounds like he always does. I'm gonna lean with Dawson here. Moving on to our next fight. Maycee Barber versus Karine Silva. This was also a pretty tough fight to pick. I'm going to pick Maycee Barber to win, though. I'm going to lean Maycee Barber in a competitive fight. You know, Maycee, she's a nice striker with a decent grappling on a 6-fight win streak right now, coming off of a dominant performance to Caitlin Simonara. And before that, she got a TKO victory over Amanda Ribas, where her counters, they were looking really sharp in that fight. You know, Like she has some really nice heavy hands, right? And facing Karine Silva, who's a decent striker herself, more of a grappler. Her last two fights, her performances haven't really been too convincing. You know, she had a close fight with Dion Barboza and then gassed out in the fight before that to Vivian Arahu, where she claimed she was on her period in that fight, which is the reason why she gassed out. You know, in this matchup, I initially went with Karine Silva to win here, but I switched to Macy Barber. But there's worry on both sides. You know, Macy Barber, she might have a seizure before the fight. Karine Silva, she really shines when she's able to get a first round submission on lower level opponents. And I don't see Silva getting Barber with a quick submission. So I'm leaning Barber to overwhelm Korean with strikes and volume, land the better shots, get in the dirty boxing exchanges, and test the durability and endurance of Korean. Because Barber will push a hard pace, you know, from the opening bell. And Korean, she's going to want that early submission here, but I don't think she gets it. You know, Korean might get some takedowns, but Macy's going to be relentless in getting up, you know, landing the better shots and probably outworking Korean here. Plus, Macy is coming in to this matchup with a chip on her shoulder. You know, she needs to have a great performance here after completely ghosting on her main event spot. You know, not even walking out into the octagon for whatever medical reason. I think she has a. I think she's going to want to have a great performance here, and I think she does gets it. You know, I think she's going to put up strong volume. She's going to have a ton of pressure, you know, and her boxing has been improving. You know, 6-fight win streak, she's durable. Whereas Silva, you know, she's dangerous early on with her submissions, but her cardio has been inconsistent, and her striking is I wouldn't say it's as good as Barber's. So I'm gonna lean with Barber to have a higher pace in this matchup. She's gonna have the better durability, and she's just gonna outwork Karine across 3 rounds. But should be a good fight. Moving on to our next fight. Jan Blachowicz versus Bogdan Grad. I mean, this is the old dog versus the new dog. I'm gonna lean with Jan Blachowicz here. You know, Bogdan Grad has come into the UFC looking phenomenal. He's on a 4-fight finishing streak, 3 knockout wins, and 1 submission, and he's looking like an absolute beast. But is he going to be able to get a quick finish over a tough veteran, a former champion like Jan Blachowicz? I don't think so. You know, Jan is really good. You know, he went to a split decision with one of the most dangerous fighters in the world versus Alex Pereira, and had a very close fight in his last fight versus a new rising prospect, Carlos Ulberg. You know, Jan, he still has that Polish power threat, and while Bogdan Grad is looking great, getting these quick finishes, they aren't to the same level of competition that Jan is losing to. And Grad has been looking promising, 100%, but I just don't think he can perform like that at this level. At least I haven't seen him do it yet. You know, I trust Jan Blachowicz more in this matchup. You know, even though he's 42 years old, he still looks good. You know, he fights good. I think he still has what it takes to compete against these guys in the division, especially getting a fighter who isn't really you know, Alex Pereira or Carlos Ulberg, still a bit untested in Bogdan Grad. You know, I like Jan Blachowicz's striking still. You know, this matchup, it's most likely going to be a striking matchup for the most part, and I see Jan being the more safer fighter, you know, not taking too many chances, staying on the outside and picking his shots better, you know, because I don't see Bogdan getting a quick finish here, and as a fight plays out longer, I think it favors Jan because he has that championship level experience, and he can probably outpoint him here, you know, because Blachowicz, he's experienced, he's technical, and he still has that dangerous power threat, and he has 5 rounds of fight IQ, right? He has that championship level experience in his arsenal. You know, this is a 3-round fight, so the experience obviously goes to Blachowicz. You know, while Grad, he is the rising prospect. You know, he's got great finishes and he's got strong momentum. I just think he's untested at the elite level. You know, so I'm gonna lean with Jan Blachowicz here. I think he has that veteran composure. I think he's gonna have the better shot selection, and he's gonna win the longer fight. You know, pick his shots better as the fight goes on. Just outpoint him here, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Henry Cejudo versus Peyton Talbott. I'm gonna lean. I'm gonna pick Peyton Talbott to win. You know, I think Peyton Talbott is gonna do some nasty stuff to Henry Cejudo. You know, Peyton, obviously a rising prospect who recently got fraud checked by an absolute beast in Raoni Barcelos. That loss has aged pretty nicely. You know, Barcelos has looked like an absolute beast. But in Peyton's last fight, Peyton looked like he really worked on his overall game. You know, many people thought he had a really tough matchup in his last fight. You know, even as an underdog, he performed great. improving a lot on the flaws that he had and seems to be back on track. Whereas Henry, he's 38 years old right now. He's getting up there in age. 3-fight losing streak. Just got outclassed by Song Yadong. And I don't see how he'll beat Talbott here. You know, his so-called elite wrestling, I don't think it will look so elite here. You know, Henry has struggled to get his game going recently, and his striking won't be better than Talbott. So I see Talbott dominating pretty much everywhere, you know, especially after his last performance. Talbott was pushing a hard pace for all 3 rounds, and it looked like he was just getting better as the fight went on. You know, I see Talbot having the youth advantage, the athletic advantage, the speed, the size and reach, the volume and pace. I think he'll be able to keep this fight standing using sharp takedown defense and capitalize on Henry's age and fighting mileage, right? And I don't think Henry will have too much success chain wrestling here. You know, he's going to be very short, so he'll also need to close the distance and try to work in some dirty boxing. But Talbot is going to make him pay anytime he closes that distance. I think Talbot is skilled enough to take out this veteran of the game, and it's a big opportunity for him to take out a former champion. I do think he gets it done, you know, because Cejudo, he's aging. He's a veteran, but he's aging. He's declining in his speed. He's had limited success recently, and he's struggling to impose his wrestling. Whereas Talbot, he's young, he's sharp, he's big for the division, and he's proving rapidly, and he puts up a high pace. I think Talbot's going to have the athletic edge. He's going to have the cleaner striking, and I think he's going to be able to outwork an aging Henry Cejudo. Moving on to our next fight. Brandon Moreno versus Tatsuro Taira. I'm gonna say Tatsuro Taira wins this fight. Tatsuro Taira, he looked like an absolute assassin in his last fight. His striking looked so clean. His speed and accuracy was so clean. Obviously, he has a crazy good jiu-jitsu game. Super slick on the mat. You know, that's what he's known for. I'm just really high on this kid. He's only 25 years old, but now facing a former champion, Moreno, who's basically in his prime years at 31 years old. I would have thought that Moreno was much older because he's been in the game for so long. But I do think Taira has a big chance of winning this fight. You know, if you look at Moreno's last 4 wins, I'm not saying they're not impressive, you know, but it's 2 older guys who've been there and done that. Like Steve Erceg in Moreno's last fight. Erceg was he's on a 3-fight losing streak right now, or he was on a 3-fight losing streak, so that's nothing too special. Then Moreno's fight before that, he beat Amir Albazi. You know, Amir isn't all that. Then an out of prime Davison Figueiredo, and before that Kai Kara France. I don't know. These guys just don't seem like a special talent. Like when you're comparing them to the potential that this kid Taira has, you know, I truly think Taira is the future of this division. He's so good, he's so young and hungry, and he hasn't tasted the belt yet, and he's on a mission right now. I think it's safe to say Taira will have the superior grappling in this matchup. I do think his striking is clean and precise enough to set up those takedowns, but even if it's just striking, I'm a big fan of Taira's striking as well. You know, Moreno, obviously he has great boxing skills, but I think that if the striking gets competitive, the ability for Taira to mix levels and shoot for takedowns can open up the possibilities for him in the striking. And I think both of these guys, they're really good. But I think Taira might just be the more motivated and hungrier guy to win here. You know, and Moreno, he is a proven champion. You know, I don't want to just talk down on his losses because they are impressive wins. You know, and Moreno, he's got great boxing. He's got really good heart. But I just think Taira is elite. You know, he has elite jiu-jitsu. He's got sharp striking. He's young and he's surging. He's got that killer mindset. And I think Taira is going to be able to mix levels here. I think he's going to look like the fresher fighter. And he's just sharper everywhere, in my opinion, right now. So I'm going to say Taira wins this fight. Moving on to the co-main event of the evening, Alexandre Pantoja versus Joshua Van. I'm going to pick Alexandre Pantoja to win here. And look, I'm a massive fan of Joshua Van. His aura, his hype, the way he strikes and puts on a show, coming off of a massive performance over the #1 contender, Brandon Royval, fighting him on short notice as well. But we're talking about the greatest flyweight of all time here. Pantoja is literally the greatest flyweight of all time. His style, it's a nightmare for literally anyone. You know, his nickname is the Cannibal, and that really portrays the level of savagery he brings into the cage. He's such a dog. You think Joshua Van's a dog? He is. But I think Pantoja is even a bigger dog. He will just walk you down, drag you down to the ground, give you zero respect, and just maul you. And that's what I see him doing here, because it's what he's been doing. You know, he's on a 8-fight win streak right now, completely clearing out the division. No one has been able to stop this man and his style. You know, Joshua Van obviously has a sick style too, high pressure, high level pressure with his strikes, maintains that aggressive pressure throughout the fight. But Pantoja's grappling, I think it's so elite. His unorthodox striking, it's really effective. He'll just blitz you and walk you down with such relentless pressure and pace. And he knows when to go for submissions. Like, I think Pantoja, he really has it all. He has all the skills, the grit, the fight IQ, all in one. And on top of that, he's super durable. He's super durable, never been finished in his whole career. Joshua Van, he's obviously really good, but he's going to have to maintain that striking distance for the whole fight and apply pressure with his strikes on top of that. And on top of that, he's going to have to defend takedowns, all throughout the fight. And I think Joshua, he might have success in countering Pantoja, because Pantoja likes to just rush forward and blitz his way into closing the distance. But I don't think the counters will be enough to drop or compromise the champion. That relentless pressure wrestling will always be there for Pantoja. Pushing Joshua Van against the cage and trying to drag him down, it'll always be there for him. And his ability to absorb punishment and keep imposing his will, that high-level submission threat as well. There's just so much you have to think about when facing Pantoja. He'll entertain the striking for a bit, throw something crazy, and before you know it, you're defending takedowns. You can defend it as well, but then you're defending another one, and then you're defending another one. That chain wrestling is crazy from the champion, and I just think eventually he will just get him down. When he does, he'll be able to submit Joshua Van. Even Pantoja, he was saying he can't bet on the sport, but if he can, he would bet on himself to win by submission, because he saw the odds for submission for his last two fights, and he was surprised at how high the odds were. He was telling us, like, bro, that was free money. He was saying him by submission, it's free money, and you just got to take his word for it. For the guy obviously means what he says. He's on a generational run right now, and I think we're lucky to be witnessing history. He's the flyweight king. I think he's gonna have relentless pressure in this matchup, elite submission skills, insane durability. He's gonna be shooting takedowns over and over again. Joshua Van's gonna be defending them. Okay, he can defend them. He's gonna eat a right hand and then go back to defending another one. I think that pressure is so overwhelming. Because Joshua Van, he is a phenomenal talent right now. He has that aggressive pressure striking style, but it's a big leap in competition. That's what we said about Royval too. But Pantoja's on a different level. I think he's gonna maul Joshua Van. He's gonna drag him down. He's most likely gonna submit Joshua Van. So I'm going to say Pantoja wins this fight. Moving on to our next fight, the main event of the evening. We got Merab Dvalishvili versus Petr Yan. The pick is Merab Dvalishvili. Petr Yan was saying he was injured in his first fight, so he wasn't able to throw his right hand, and the fight will be different this time, which sounds really familiar to what another opponent of Merab was saying. Umar was saying he broke his hand too, and so can we just take their words for it? Is Merab really just getting lucky facing high-level contenders while they're injured? I highly doubt it. Merab has been in fights dealing with injuries himself, and he still powers through them. This dude's will to win is undeniable. You can't question his ability to push a pace, and he's just an absolute cannon. Petr Yan's game, it mostly runs on his superior boxing skills. His ability to walk opponents down with a ton of pressure and then drown them, along with having great durability and a high fight IQ when it comes to striking as well. He's on a 3-fight win streak right now, been looking great. But those guys that he's beating, they don't have Merab's style. Merab, he obviously has the gas tank to push a crazy pace all 25 minutes. We just saw his striking is looking really sharp, almost knocking out Corey Sandhagen in his last fight. Super aggressive. Insane chain wrestling. I don't see anything being different in this rematch. I just can't pick against Merab like pretty much ever. Petr Yan can defend those takedowns, but that's only going to wear his gas tank down. And when you're so worried about defending those takedowns, you're going to leave yourself open to strikes. That's pretty much what happened to Corey Sandhagen. And that's going to happen here. That's going to open up the striking opportunities for Merab, Petr Yan being so worried about those takedowns. And we know he can do that for multiple rounds. He can go 10 rounds if he wants to. And I'm pretty sure it was in the first Petr Yan fight where Merab attempted like 50 plus takedowns. Merab made it look so easy, and he makes it look so easy. every time against these high level guys. And now they're giving him someone that he already beat. You know, he has that mental edge on him already, and already, along with the suffocating fighting style. You can see Merab opponents get visibly frustrated during his fights. It's like they know they can't do anything when they're pressed up against the cage, getting kneed to the thigh, getting their feet stomped on, only to break away for less than a second to breathe. But then they eat a massive right hand, and it's back to defending those takedowns. I think it's just such a suffocating style. It's so tough for anyone, especially if you're primarily a striker. You know, this should be Merab all day. You know, it is really weird to see Petr Yan as a plus 400 underdog. Because Petr Yan is really high level. He's got clean boxing, a high fight IQ. But I think he's going to struggle with that nonstop wrestling pressure. You know, Merab obviously being the cardio machine, putting up an insane pace with endless takedown attempts and sharp improving striking. I think the pace of Merab, the pressure of Merab, and the chain wrestling, it's going to drown Petr Yan once again. So give me Merab to defend his title for 4 times in a row this year, breaking records. And he's so motivated to break records. You know, he speaks about that all the time. He wants to be generational. You know, he wants to be put in the history books. He wants to break these records, and defending his title for the 4th time in a row, that's a new record that he's breaking, you know? So this guy, we're witnessing history here. I think he gets it done. And that concludes these picks for this week's UFC fight card. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys thought. You know, I'll see you in the next one. Peace out, brothers. And that was 4 weeks. 4 weeks in a row where all the most confident picks come through. 4 weeks in a row. I'm rich. Peace out. I'm out. Peace.